Welcome everyone to our discussion on the importance of the history of economic thought in research and teaching in economics. And this is actually a premiere. This is the first in a loose series of public NOUS Widebeam events sponsored by the Network for Constitutional Economics and Social Philosophy. It's nice that we start off with such a wide international audience. Thank you all for being here this evening. And on this topic of the importance of the history of economic thought, we have two discussants today. On the one side, we have Stefan Kolev from the University of Applied Sciences at Zwickau in Germany, who is a professor of economic policy there and also a very prominent researcher on the history of economic thought. He has published in leading journals in the field, and he's also an editor of two journals of the Ordo Yearbook, the very a journal with a long tradition in Germany and a very good standing, I hope, in Germany, and also the Journal of Contextual Economics, formerly the Schmollers Jahrbuch. And on the other side, we have Rudi Bachmann, who is a professor of economics at the University of Notre Dame with a focus on macroeconomics. He does both theoretical and empirical work. He has published, for example, in the American Economic Review, the European Economic Review, and very regularly in the Journal of Monetary Economics, one of the top fields in macroeconomics. And apart from being a highly recognized macroeconomist, Rudi is also very much engaged in methodological debates, very well known in Germany for being engaged in methodological debates. So I think we have we can expect a very lively discussion between the both this evening. We will have brief opening statements from the two discussants, and then we'll have a conversation between both of them for about 45 minutes to 1 hour, depending on how it goes. And after this, the floor will be open for questions and remarks from the audience. And you can already enter your questions or remarks into the chat, and we will try to include as many of them as possible as they come in. So I think let's start with the opening statements. So let's start with Stefan, I think. About 5 minutes for the opening statement. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you so much, Jan, and thank you to the NOUS Network, but above all to all of you for the time to discuss a field which, as Jan said, is very close to my heart, and I hope tonight we'll have a fruitful discussion. I would like to start with a disclaimer. So what I will not do is I will not bash today's economics. I will not call it mainstream or neoclassical, but above all, I will not bash it. What I hope to contribute by that introductory statements, but also by all the other comments, is really to show how history economic thought can add and contribute to the beauty of today's economics. So how can we make today's economics even better and even more colorful, both in teaching and in research? My main proposition is that we have to look very closely and carefully at the notion of scientific progress in economics. And so while I do not deny that, of course, there is progress, I doubt that it is linear. Instead, I buy into the diagnosis of Josef Schumpeter, who says that progress in economics proceeds in a crisscross manner, which probably in his German or Austrian mind means zigzag. And so what I would like to say is that we often forget. Now, sometimes we forget for good reasons, right? So if theory or a method is really flawed, if it has logical deficiencies, we should forget it. But very often we forget for other reasons. We forget out of fads and fashion, so certain theories become fashionable and, well, collect lots of followers. Sometimes we forget for reasons of power, so sociology of science is important. Sometimes we forget because a theory at a certain point of time and space loses its topicality and is forgotten because it doesn't help to shed light on a certain moment of modernity. But that topicality can return, and so forgetting for those last reasons can be a problem. What I'm struggling with, and I hope that tonight we will find some at least partial answers to that, is that we do not have a clear-cut criterion to distinguish or let's say to show whether new knowledge per se, understood as the knowledge in the last issues of the best journals, is really all we should know, and whether everything which has been forgotten and is not published in those journals is cut out correctly so. So the Popperian mindset, which most of us implicitly have and have been taught since undergrads, in my view of economics, doesn't really, or can have deficiencies. And if it does, so if we have scientific progress in that crisscross, not systematic, non-linear pattern, then I believe that history economic thought can be a very rich treasure trove, or if you prefer, somewhat less pathetically, a set of tools which can be harnessed with relatively little effort as low-hanging fruit. So as I would hope to show, and as I hope the discussion will show, quite economically so. I have 5 points which I would briefly like to make on why history economic thought is important for students and then for researchers. To start with the students. So in Germany, at least, the field of economics has been in relative decline over the past 20 years. So I started studying 20 years ago in Hamburg, and I checked the numbers, and the field is basically staying, roughly speaking, the same size, whereas fields like business or law have been exploding. And so how can we perhaps help by some small add-on of history economics? How can we help? Well, to begin with, I hope that students who start out studying economics with social problems on their minds might recognize, by encountering such a course in their first semesters, that economics is about social problems, which in today's teaching is not very obvious when we start with teaching economics. Second, I hope that students will take pride in that field, in their choice of having picked economics, so that they should basically get proud of the intellectual plenty which modern economics, but also economics before Adam Smith have, and also the formative power of economics on the modern world. And that pride should help us keep those students who quite often jump off and switch to other fields. Third, I hope that students will learn to read and write, which is not really what we quite often teach them. And so history economics can help a little bit in both those dimensions. And we have Deidre McCloskey among us, so that is not unimportant to underscore. Fourth, I hope that students will be able to recognize economists as humans. Now, if you know Rudy from Twitter is probably quite different from Rudy in his papers. But since it's helpful to know him also as a person, and it's helpful also to study history of economics as a history of humans and also institutions, but especially humans who produced economic thought, because otherwise meeting those people only through their theorems or axioms is not really what these people were about. Fifth and last, I hope that history economics can help students with critical thinking, not meaning that other fields in economics, other courses do not underscore critical thinking, but I do believe that if you learn a plurality of methods and theories, you can progress. And with a smiley, I would like to add that it's also helpful for remembering all those methods and theories. So mnemotechnically, it's helpful to have heard a little bit about the people who have generated those theories and methods. Why is it helpful for researchers? And with that, I would like to conclude those introductory remarks. So given today's specialization of economics, which is wonderful and inevitable, and given the crisis of our time, there is demand for economics, but the question is, can researchers profit from having more knowledge of the history of economics to meet that specific demand today? My first point is that economists can get concrete inspirations from history economics. I have an acquaintance who is at MIT, made a great career, and he specifically says that he, doing labor economics, that he profits quite a bit from history of recent economics, which focuses on his field. That is one example out of many. And of course, the history of recent economics is the most obvious candidate, but not the only one. Given that specialization, which we have today, and which Hayek, who by the way passed away today, if it cares for you, some of you. So if we have that specialization, we need, as I I think, some shared identity of economists. And historians of economics and the teaching of history economics could be one part of contributing to that shared identity, because otherwise we would have those specialists who have difficulties to not only talk to each other, but really perceive themselves as a community with an identity. Third, it helps also researchers to debunk certain myths which they have just picked up in textbooks, like Say's law, or with the notion that Adam Smith only understood absolute advantage and not comparative advantage. Current research has a lot to say about those interesting things. And I think researchers may really get some more sophisticated notion of the concepts they are using than the traditional and sometimes flawed knowledge out of textbooks. Fourth, that we, by studying history economics as researchers, we also get more attentive to issues of value judgment and normativity, and by that become more critical of our role as experts, which not only in the Corona crisis is extremely topical, but which quite a few of us, I think, just practice without having reflected too much about it. And fifth, I would like to say that, again, Deirdre McCloskey is among us, by studying those old texts, I think we can appreciate the role of rhetoric and see when and with what rhetoric economists at certain points of time and space were particularly successful in helping society solve its problems, and what rhetoric was perhaps less helpful. My concluding sentence of those introductory remarks is this. Crawford Goodwin, who was the doyen of history economics and a long-standing professor at Duke, passed away 4 years ago, has identified a golden age of history of economics in the 20th century, with names like Hayek, Hicks, Keynes, Robbins, Rafa, Stigler, Weiner, or more recently, Arrow and Samuelson. Now, Rudy and I are not those graced minds, right? So none of us is Hayek or Arrow or Samuelson, that for sure. And certainly, economics as practiced today is much more specialized than it used to be. But what I hope for is really a division of labor between theorists and historians. And I hope that discussions like tonight's will be more fruitful and show that those division of labors can be made fruitful if they were not perhaps in the recent past. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Stefan, for this opening statement. And I think we should continue with Rudi right away and giving his opening statement.
Yeah, thank you. Good evening, everyone. At least I assume most of you are it's evening, but it's just early afternoon. Thanks to the NOUS network for inviting me. It's a great honor and a great pleasure to be here. And there's lots to agree on, actually, what Stefan said, and perhaps we can do so later in the discussion. Obviously, since I didn't know Stefan's opening statement, I don't have a direct reply to him, so I'll have to do that a bit later. So I'll just start with my prepared remarks. So personally, I'm actually a great fan of the history of thought. This basically started, just to give you a little biographical tidbit here, this started with my master thesis in philosophy in Mainz, where it was a sort of a scientific philosophy of science econ master thesis, and there I read a lot of economists long forgotten, like people like, I don't know, I mean, most of you probably have heard of them in this crowd, but in a normal econ crowd, people wouldn't even know, like Friedrich von Gottel or Lilienfeld, for example. Anyway, and I've always found reading sort of textbooks about history of thought interesting, and I've sort of always loved this as sort of, bedtime reading, I guess. And I'd love to have the time to, to sit an entire lecture by Stefan or Arash, who I deeply admire, mostly through our interactions on Twitter, okay? So I do think, of course, that a scientific discipline has a certain conscience of its historical development, a sense of its place in history, and that it, that there was a development to where we are. I think that's good. And for, as Stefan mentioned already, for no other reason that we don't want to kind of repeat past mistakes, right? So we have to be aware of them. So, okay, so, and now there's a big but, because I guess the choreography of this whole evening requires that, you know, I guess, I don't know, the anti guy or the contrarian. Although I'm reluctant, as I said, as my initial remarks should highlight, a little bit reluctantly so. But just in terms of, you know, the rhetorical device, we need to ask questions at least. So how does this look concretely when we say we would like to have more history of thought, say, in our undergraduate curricula? Let's start with that, right? You know, take Germany, we have a very regulated bachelor. I mean, in the United States, situation a bit different, but in Germany, it's a very regulated major. You know, there's very little room for sort of free study, if you wish. And so, you know, by the time you are through with the basics and the, you know, the core, what people consider the core, and then you would like, you know, some specialization in some fields. And then on top of that, you might want to have, you know, all the other things like economic history that, especially recently, a lot of people think has become more important. And I agree with that. You know, especially in macroeconomics, I think we have reached a bigger appreciation of sort of the long development. Moritz Schulerich, for example, in Germany has contributed to that a lot. And then maybe on top of that, we would like to have our students sit in, you know, a sociology class, a political science class, a philosophy of science class, something like that. So you kind of see where I'm going. The curriculum gets more crowded and ever more crowded. And at some point, you just have to choose, right? And so if you demand, or if someone demands that history of thought should be more a bigger part in our, say, undergraduate curriculum, we might have to think about what we're going to throw out. Okay. Similarly, with the PhD curricula, again, I'm still always struggling with what to put in, you know, in our PhD curricula. Typically in the United States, it's a 2-year program, a 2-year course program. That's somewhat different. That's not always the case in Germany, at least, but in the United States, it's a 2-year curriculum. That's, again, very, very crowded. And it's not clear what you would want to take out, right? Do you want to take out core macro? Do you want to take out econometric techniques? And I mean, especially these new techniques that keep piling up. Currently, we are seeing a big data revolution, you know, machine learning techniques, sort of a whole new toolbox added on to economics, then also textual analysis, web scraping. So we can do things now that we won't even be able to do really. Certainly when, almost when I did my PhD 15 years ago, but certainly 20 years ago. And so, you know, how do we add on that? And then on top of that, you know, maybe an obligatory history of economics class, of history of thought class. It's not clear how to do that, okay? In addition, and here I'm speaking particularly, I guess, about the Germans situation. It's not just limited time budget, it's also limited budget period. And in particular, limited sort of small economics department, right? That's the reality in Germany. We have sort of for, I guess, political reasons, the decision has been made that at nearly every university, you should be able to study nearly every field, and also economics. There are very few universities in economics in Germany where you can't study economics. But that means basically, given that, you know, for political reasons, we are going, many universities have to have some econ professors. There are very few universities, unlike in the US, where you have large departments, right? And then every time that is the case, you need to think, you know, what fields, what sub-disciplines you sort of split your professors between, right? That's the issue. And so if we take that institutional given, of course, we can dream of a different land where maybe, you know, not every university has an econ department in Germany, but then the ones that remain, they have 50 econ professors. And then, of course, it's I think it's a very different proposition to say we also have these econ departments with 50 professors have a strong history of thought group as well. But if we take the institutions more or less as given as they are, I think the only way to sort of make a push for a greater role in economic history is basically the push that I think that has to, every sort of subfield in some sense has to sort of fight for, is to concentrate it at 1 or 2 universities, right? I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, maybe economic historians of thought work differently, but I work best when I'm around other macroeconomists or frankly other microeconomists. So I believe that you need a critical mass. And so I think the best way to think about that is is there a way to sort of follow the Düsseldorf model that what Düsseldorf did with industrial organization, where they basically said, okay, our faculty, our department is concentrated. We don't have that many resources, but we concentrate in industrial economics and competition economics. Okay, and to a certain extent, Siegen is a way of sort of doing this for the history of thought. Although not everyone here on that panel may agree or may have different opinions on whether that's a successful attempt or not. And I guess that has to be the way to go, especially if you also want, a few departments that are strong in economic history, not just history of thought, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe that's the way forward if we think about sort of resource allocation within sort of the current framework. Although, I mean, given that no one can degree this from above, this has to come organically from interested research networks. I guess the last point is that to the extent that I would also agree that it would be nice to have more history of economic thought in our curricula, both undergraduate and the doctoral programs. Here's what I would not like to have. I would not like to see sort of a quasi-philological hermeneutical approach to this. So a la, what has that old white man or that white man actually said exactly? I couldn't care less. I don't find this particularly interesting. I don't care whether Keynes said, what Hicks claimed he said ultimately, or what the post-Keynesians said he said ultimately. Why is that interesting? I mean, a lot of these dead old white men, they were confused, like we are confused about things, and sort of trying to reconstruct exactly what they said. I don't find that particularly interesting. But I do think that a history of economic thought can be done differently, and then I find it extremely interesting. Namely, sort of the big ideas, sort of the history of big ideas, right? So, to give you an analogy, in American college educations, especially at the upper end, what often is offered, often from a political science teacher or a historic teacher, is sort of a big picture, big ideas class, right? Sort of big historical ideas class, where you basically go from, I don't know, the ancient Greece. I mean, a lot of people have criticized that as well as too Eurocentric, too Western-centric, but that's sort of a side issue. But anyway, sort of you have these big idea classes, these big historical lines classes. And I think if history of economic thought could be that for econ, I think that would be extremely useful. Yeah, maybe I'll leave it at that. Maybe one more point when we talked about sort of the limited bachelor constraint. I'm not sure I share Stefan's optimism that students, bachelor students, and maybe we just have different experiences, quite frankly, but that sort of bachelor students would be, that would be something to gain back the bachelor crowd for us in Germany, at least. In the US, we don't have this problem because mostly, mostly the business administration, albeit has changed a little bit in the sense that at some universities, business is an undergraduate degree, but in many it isn't, and I don't think it will become. And so, the econ departments have their students, and in fact, at Notre Dame, even though actually the business school has a business major, our major has been growing continually, and I mean, we basically cannot stop it. And at some point, we actually talk about a cap in our enrollment because we just can't teach so many students. So we are not exactly in the same situation as you guys across the Atlantic, where students are running away from you. But I have my doubts that sort of, you know, giving them extensive history of thought lectures would really pull them in, right? At the end of the day, 90% of these students, and I guess this is true even for a lot of economic students in Germany, even though they could do business administration, at the end of the day, these people want to work for a bank, or these are very practically minded kids. And I'm not sure all that, and don't get me wrong, Stefan, this is a positive statement, not a normative statement. I wish they would be interested in the history of thought. I'm just not as optimistic as you are about their motives, quite frankly. Anyway, maybe I'll leave it at that, and yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot, Rudi, for the statement. Stefan, would you like to answer right away? Or?
Yes, if it's possible. Yeah.
Yes, of course.
So thank you. And as Rudi said, we should not construct like dichotomous debates. Certainly, I agree with many of the things, and the discussion is getting in the fruitful direction I was hoping for. So to start with the undergrad education, and I fully agree with you that in the US, for various reasons, you have a very different situation, and I mean, colleges are struggling, universities are getting more undergrads than they used to be. You have many more international students, et cetera, et cetera. So you have a sort of a luxury situation. But if we look at the German situation on the undergrad level first, I did some work and had a look at the stereotypical shares which undergrads study, right? So if we assume that it's like 6 semesters, 30, roughly speaking, 30 hours per semester, which they're getting taught. So the shares are, they get 20% of business, management, and law. 80%, that is data from FAZ, 18% are about methods, and 21% are about micro and macro. Now, what I plea for on the undergrad level is a lecture, one, that ideally should be somewhere in the beginning for the reasons I outlined. And since I studied business and since I teach business students, my suggestion very practically would be to deduct those hours from the business hours, because I have not experienced economic students who are fascinated with business. And as you said, the threshold to migrate to business are low anyway. So very practically speaking, I would try to deduct it from there. I agree with you that we have legal constraints, but haven't been in accreditation rounds. I know that those constraints sometimes are softer than we usually assume they are. So that is on the undergrad level. And I think the critical questions are, and you raised them, whom are we actually educating? And what are we actually maximizing? So our qualitative question and a quantitative one. The qualitative question, I think, is probably the decisive one. As I see today's undergrads education, we actually educate them to become grad students. Now, very few of them become grad students. Many become journalists, many become work as bureaucrats in ministry, many become whatever, as you said, banking specialists. So we're not really, and we're educating them to be able to enter grad school. So I think if we think of the job description in that broader sense, as I mentioned it, I think history and methodology and philosophy in those homeopathic doses which I propose, I think can make them, again, more proud, and as I said, hopefully also more sticky, as opposed to running away to law, sociology, political science, business, or the like. So this is my
Can I chime in here? Can I chime in here? So otherwise I'll forget what I wanted to say.
Sure.
So is that okay, Stefan?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so look, I'm actually in agreement with you. I'd love to take some stuff away from the business administration guys. The more we take away from them, you will get me. You had me there basically. You had me at taking it away from the BWL guys. No, but you know, kidding aside. Yeah, good luck. You know, at a university. I mean, I've albeit shortly, but I've been at a you know, in a mixed faculty with BWL colleagues at German university, and good luck taking anything away from them. I'm glad that you try, and I wish you good luck. And anyway, I'm with you. I'm totally with you. I'm also with you in the sense that I think it's a mistake to educate undergraduates towards grad school. Indeed, that's exactly, and in that sense, the situation in Germany and the US really is different, right? Because that's something we don't do in the US. In the US, we do if anything, the opposite. We don't educate them for grad school. We tell them to go to the math department if you want to go to grad school, basically. And so we educate them to be citizens, in some sense, educated citizens that have a broad knowledge of economics. But you're right, in Germany that's not the case, and I'd like to see more of that. And I agree actually that history of economic thought could at least play some role into that. I think more has to change, I think, right? If you really wanted to do that, then you have to go a little bit more the US way and say, you know, probably take away a little bit from the business class, even more from the business classes, but that makes it even more difficult in the internal faculty struggles. But, you know, then you want them to have a political science class, a sociology class, perhaps a philosophy of science class, et cetera, something that you get if you sort of do a normal US education where you declare a major in your sophomore year. And so you have at least the first year, but also the sophomore year, the second year, you know, to do much more what we call in Germany a Studium Generale. And so, I'm a big fan of the US undergraduate education system, the liberal arts system. At least as in the upper echelons, I think it still works. It's basically the only place in the world, with few exceptions, that is truly still living the Humboldt ideal in a way that Germany actually isn't anymore, where it came from, right? And so you have me there. I'm just less optimistic that sort of given the way, given the realities on the ground, that it will be so easily implementable. I guess that's all I'm saying.
No, I don't say it's easy. I just say it's a way, right? And I wanted just to show that the hours which we try to deduct from somebody, for example, business, are very few out of the total curriculum, which in the 6 semesters people cover. But I agree with you that a move towards the US undergraduate education, as you described it, would be a benefit. And that brings me actually to my larger point, which is, as you said, the resources which are needed to teach, right? So in the very short run, nobody in this crowd, and I see many friends, are dreaming of a chair dedicated to history, economic thought in Germany. I mean, that would be utopian, right? But what we do dream of, and we have Michael Burda among us who did that at Humboldt.
I would support that, by the way. I think we should have a bunch of chairs, in fact, for history of economic thought.
If that could make it into tomorrow's newspaper, I would be very happy as a result of the debate. But again, Bulgarians are sort of humble, and I'm a Hayekian, and we have today's Hayek's passing. So let me stress humility. So what I really hope for in the short run are adjuncts, right? So Lehrbeauftragte who do the job in faculties which have interest in that, but don't have the chair they have to take away from labor or international trade or whatever. Now in the mid-run, however, I hope that Jan, you and I agree that the German system with those silo-like chairs has to change anyway. So in the mid-run, I dream of a structural transformation of those departments anyway. And that would basically mean that somebody teaching history of thought would be, sorry for the non-German speakers, but I'll try to do it as best as possible. So something like entfristeter Mittelbau. So it doesn't have to be a full professor. It has to be somebody who is passionate about teaching and who has a tenured non-professorial job and who can do that. So we can take one W3 big position, split it into 2 or 3, let's say 2, and make small positions of that kind.
I think you are too modest, honestly. I think you are too modest. You have to have chaired professorships. That's the university system in Germany is is structured around those, and the only one who counts at the end of the day are chair professorships. And I think the best idea is to capture a department the way, you know, Siegen has done this, the way Düsseldorf has done this with IO. And you have to be smart about it, okay? That you have to find an opening where, you know, there's a department restructuring. And the funny thing, or the interesting thing, if you actually look at the Düsseldorf development, Düsseldorf has been so successful. They started out with an extremely tiny department, again, focused on competition policy, but now they grew. They have all these Stiftungsprofessoren, because a sort of third-party finance professorships, because they were successful. So the resources will come if you're good at something, I think. And so I just having, you know, people doing this sort of at low pay, you know, without protection from a big dog or two big dogs, I think you're setting these people up for failure. I think you got to be bold. You have to have a group, one or two somewhere in Germany. You know, there's among you, I see a few that are professorable, or whatever they call it in Germany. Professorable in German. I don't know how you translate this in English, professorable. And you know, there has to be some kind of lobbying, I guess, together with other people that can help you there to try to build this. I think that's the only way you're gonna do it. Just having some lectures here and there that are kind of lonely and overworked. I'm not sure that will work, despite, I believe you are right, they have a lot of passion, and so that will compensate for a lot, but I'm just not optimistic that they will have anything to say, given the system is set up where basically you're only a human being once you are a professor. Unfortunately, that's the way in Germany still.
Well, I fully agree with that. And that, of course, would be the first best. I mean, no doubt about that. And that was actually my last point. Like the long-run hope which I have is that German departments, small as they are, as you mentioned, would actually realize that not every German econ department can be Bonn.
Right. I agree with that, yes.
And so that is my really long-term vision, that departments, as you said, like Siegen, will realize that the only way to succeed and to prosper is to dare to be different, as Buchanan would say. So, but again, I cannot shape that, and the youngsters you see here cannot shape that. We do whatever we can, and what I want to underscore is, again, in the short run, I hope for adjuncts. In the mid run, I hope for some endowed chair. Indeed, that would be the way to go. But as you know, the culture of endowed chairs in Germany is a little bit baby-like. And in the long run, I do hope that departments will realize that we cannot make it the Bonn way. And then those would be like biotops of PPE. And basically we have PPE already, philosophy, politics, and economics all across the country, including Düsseldorf. But my hope is that it's not only PPE. PPE is a wonderful niche, but those are different types of students. I mean, many of them are here online. I really hope that for the econ students proper, we will find in those non-utopian short-run, mid-term, long-run perspective, that we'll also find for them some exposure, right? The PPE students already either self-organize it or get it anyway, whereas my hope is that the econ students proper should also get it. And a last point on that, the history of economic thought, or history of economics as we usually call it, community is very vivid, including people like Arash age, my age. We have Beatrice Cherrier here among us. So we exist. We try to publish as well as that is possible. We try to organize sessions at the ASSA, which are always well attended. And so I do hope that in the, let's say in 10 years from now, what you pleaded for might be reality, but I think it's a long way to go, realistically speaking. And I hope tonight and discussions like this one might get us somewhat closer to that first best which you described.
I have a question for Stefan. I found a nice quote from Robert Heilbronner from 1979 already, where he complains that even in his day, the history of economic thought curriculum has been condensed to just one course in one semester, and it's just not enough. And he goes on about this. So it's a process that's going on for decades now, that history of economic thought is a bit marginalized in the curricula. Do you think there have been strategic mistakes been made by historians of economic thought themselves, or do you see this group just as victims of a broader development?
Well, that's a very important question. Now, Heilbronner, of course, is biased himself, having written one of the most beautiful books and being a Schumpeter student. So he certainly has stakes in that game, but certainly it's a long decline. And in the US, the Center for the History of Political Economy at Duke is basically the last place where you can get it, where you can get historians of economics at one place in the cluster type of way, which Rudy pleaded for, and we have Bruce Caldwell also online. Now, certainly, historians of economics have also committed mistakes. In Germany, but Ecki pleaded that we stop the German case. The problem, of course, is that all those questions certainly are specific in a context, but certainly history of economics is not a substitute for theory, and perhaps historians of economics didn't always show that what they were really doing and did not convince their colleagues. Second, I think it is I call it a sin. I'm not sure if that's the precise term, but that's how I feel it. It's a sin to practice history of economics because you dislike today's economics, because that's basically the best way to get enemies in the world out there full of brilliant economists. And if you bash them all the time, and if you tell them how stupid they are and how smart you are as a heterodox guy, that is not useful at all. So you should say that you're a heterodox economist or whatever, but you should not say that you're a historian. You're harming history that way. And many historians of economics, at least in the past, I don't see that in the young generation, but at least in the past, that has been a motivation, right? To say, well, I want to show the smart guys like Rudy that they're stupid by doing history. That has certainly done a damage to history of economics. And of course, economics itself has changed. As I briefly mentioned, that golden generation of people like Hicks and Hayek and well, up to the lecture series at Stanford also had a chance to get into existence because Ken Arrow was also a historian of economics, apart from everything else he was. But of course, they could do theory and history, and they could publish in any journal, right? So today, you cannot put a history of thought paper in a top journal, unlike it's the JPE and it's something cute about Chicago, but anything cute about Chicago has already been said. So even the JPE wouldn't probably take you. So those things have changed. And again, I do believe that the major mistake of historians of economics might have been not to explain why we have a reason to exist and to do it out of that ideological, let's bash and hate the so-called mainstream perspective, which I think has really created unnecessary enemies.
I would agree with that, but I mean, not in terms of a personal experience. I think you guys are by now too rare to meet many of you. So, but I guess it is. I guess this is exactly right. If you do the history of economic thought out of spite for modern economics, then I think this is exactly the wrong reason why you do it. And again, I would sort of reiterate what I said in my introduction, and I saw already in the chat some, and maybe we can come to that disagreement. If you view history of economic thought as mainly a discipline of philology, of hermeneutics, I think this is the wrong approach. At least you won't get allies with modern economists, if that's what you wish. If you don't care, if you want allies in the German department or in the history department, then that's okay. But if you want your practicing economics colleagues to sort of to take you seriously or to be interested in what you're doing, that's the right word. I think you gotta stop these endless debates, what certain economists in the past said, and also, well, yeah, exactly what they exactly meant. So that this sort of the joke that runs around sort of mainstream modern economists, although you are right, we shouldn't use these words, is basically, sort of what Keynes really said. Are you kidding me? I don't care, and so, it's interesting what, I find it extremely interesting that so many different things came out of what Keynes said, but I just cannot be interested in these endless debates of what he really said. So what if he said many things that can be, that can be interpreted in many different ways? Isn't that a good thing? I would say. Why do we even have to fight about these things? Anyway, so if that's how you build history of economic thought, I think you're not going to get any allies. But as I said, if it's about the main ideas, if you sort of really, what are the main ideas? What are the thoughts that are, sort of that go through from, that are generated by someone and then go through maybe until the very day, even though we don't really know, and what are the crisscrosses, what are the connections between these big ideas? If that's your idea of economic history, I think you will get sort of practicing modern economists on board. And so, in that sense, I would also slightly disagree with something that Stefan said at the very beginning, and most of the stuff I actually agree with. He said, but this one, I was a bit. I'm hesitant, at least when he said, students need to feel that economists are human. Yeah, maybe, but at a sort of a teacher professor level, that might be true. Okay, but I don't care all that much what kind of human being Keynes was, or what kind of human being Adam Smith was. Honestly, that's not so interesting to me. That might be fun bedtime reading, but as an economist, I don't know why is Keynes more interesting than other historical figures. So that, I don't know. Me, I'm a completely unremarkable person. No one needs to know. People should read my JMEs, if they want to learn something from me, but they don't need to know anything about, my biography or anything. And frankly, most economists bigger up the food chain from me, if you actually meet them, they're rather dull people, to be honest. I don't know that we need to know them on a personal level as human beings. And so I'm interested in their ideas. I'm not interested in, in their private lives, quite frankly. So this whole humanization of economists, professors as teachers should be approachable. So that for sure, but that's to me a very different notion. But do I need to know, what Ken Arrow was in his private life? I don't know.
But even if it may be uninteresting for students that Keynes was a bit of a flamboyant person, maybe it would be interesting for them.
We have the Keynes-Hayek rap video, right? That's useful.
Yeah, right.
That's useful to get the students interested. I'm all for that. Sure.
Yeah, but still, isn't it? If I look at modern macro textbooks, they go straight to the models or straight to the empirical research strategy, and there's very little historical context there. But wouldn't it be much easier for students to understand, for example, Keynesian macroeconomics, even new Keynesian macroeconomics, if they have an idea where it comes from historically, if they know in which context Keynes thought about his ideas about involuntary unemployment?
No, okay, I agree with you. Keynes is sort of a, is a flamboyant person. It might be fun to have a box there. I'm not disagreeing with you. But now that you're talking about new Keynesian economics, right? Mike Woodford. God bless him. I love Mike. But he's a rather dull person.
Yeah, sure.
You can have a beer with Mike, but there's nothing. I don't know what a box should be about. About Mike Woodford, honestly. And again, I love Mike. Don't take this as a.
No, I won't go to the persons, but I guess you would understand, for example, even things like the breakdown of the Phillips curve. You would understand this as a student probably much easier if you not know too many things about the persons involved, but if you know the historical context in which they
I agree
came
with
to their
that.
theories. And
but that, if I may, that of course is something that shouldn't only be taught in history of thoughts classes. This is something that should be, if you go into my macroeconomic lecture, when I talk about the Phillips curve, you will learn that, of course, right? So of course you will learn about the idea that people thought this was a structural relationship, and then it stopped being, and it really never was, quite frankly. And sort of then I talk about this idea of, you know, statistical relationships versus structural relationships. And of course, that if that's what you what you want, of course, but that's not really knowing about the persons involved, but about the sort of the historical situations when these concepts came up. I even give my American students the famous Chancellor Schmidt quote, you know, about the unemployment and inflation, right? I'd rather have 8% more 8% inflation than 8% unemployment or something like that. And so I even tell that to my American students. And so, yeah, I give them these contexts. So but I think that should already happen in a good subject letter, quite frankly.
But would you say that it does happen? I don't think you're generalizable in that way. Right, so you studied philosophy, as you said, and I hope you were generalizable. But and I don't want to speak about my personal education, but again, at least in Germany, I would doubt that people. And again, the difference is probably a small conceptual clarification could help. Of course, there is a difference between a biography and intellectual biography. I mean, many of us here in the room are also interested in the biographies of, say, Keynes and Hayek, but the intellectual biography is indispensable if you want to understand how Keynes wanted to rescue capitalism, right? So not being interested in his private life, even though the demarcation line is probably difficult, but you cannot, I think you can motivate students much better to understand what he was doing if you told them about him, if you told them, well, was he really a socialist? Was he a liberal? What was he trying to rescue? So that could motivate them to really understand that birth of modern macro, not the question of his sexual life or things like that. I mean,
I agree with you. I try to tell our friends from the young liberals in Germany who always claim that Keynes was a socialist. I always tell them Keynes wanted to save capitalism, was not against capitalism, right, Paul?
And we should put that into macro, right? So I don't say that all history economics should be taught by historians of economics in a history economics class.
Right, I agree with that. I fully agree with that. Yes.
Ideally, anybody who teaches economics should contextualize, but since not that many people do, and since we believe in division of labor, and since we have become so specialized, I think it could be outsourced in such a class. If everybody did, this would be a non-agenda, right?
I think you might want to have both. I mean, but if you have colleagues that sort of specialize in this, you know, you also get maybe more of a culture. I mean, and again, the German situation with the Lehrstuhls, with the chair system, which has these very isolated units where often people don't talk to each other. But, you know, if in a more department system, which, you know, maybe Germany is ultimately going in the limit, you know, you will hopefully have some spillovers, right? And if you have sort of an economic historian that over lunch will tell you these stories, then maybe you start putting them in your lecture as well. And that would be the best. Wouldn't that be the best of both worlds?
If you ask me if I want to work in a Duke-like cluster of historians of economics in Leipzig, well, of course the answer is yes, right? Yeah. So if I'm allowed to dream of such a world, no doubt. And I go regularly to Duke, and it's a gigantic pleasure, right? But again, to make the historians of economics case, we don't need, at the moment at least, or well, realistically speaking, in the short run, we don't need Duke. We don't need 5 historians of economics at a cluster, which will probably never happen in the next 20 years, because the community is so lively and is so virtually connected. We have a history of economics society in the US, we have a European society, so that collaboration, which used to be important locally, and certainly to a certain extent still is important locally, we can handle through, I mean, the societies, and of course now in the Zoom age, even more so virtually. So that is not, I think, I mean, that would be wonderful to have, but I think it's so beyond the possible that, again, making those small steps institutionally would be what I would dare to hope for.
I think we should.
Can I ask something? Can we ask one of the audience? I actually would like to. I would be curious to hear from Bruce how the day-to-day interaction is at Duke. By the way, how that works, where sort of normal econ department, quote unquote, sits next to a big and very famous economic history of thought and philosophy of economics group. And is there any daily interaction, and what does it look like, if I can? I don't want to put you on the spot, obviously, but I would be extremely curious to see.
So the center raises all of its money from the outside. Duke pays my salary, but all of the money for the fellowship program, our summer institute, our lecture series, and the other things that we do, workshops, etc., is raised from private funds. So I think it's a model that is perhaps difficult to reproduce in Europe, for sure. Perhaps a little more able to happen in the United States, although, yeah, our center has actually been funded by the federal government from the National Endowment for the Humanities. We get money from the Koch Foundation, and we get money from George Soros. So it's an ideologically diverse set of funders, all of whom see the value of economists knowing a little bit about the history of their discipline. So I think it's a unique case. I mean, we're a cog in the machine. We're trying to help people who are interested in the history of economics come and get a little better at their trade, and hopefully be able to get a position. But like Stefan, I think there's a short run game, a middle run game, and a long run game. Luckily, I won't have to worry about the long run game. But you folks, I'm always happy to see so many young people who are interested in the field. And it's and I will just say, I mean, I think if you provide the field, if students can take the field, that to me is the starting point. The reason it's difficult is that if people retire and no one replaces them, they can't even take it. But if you just allow students to have the choice, a lot of the best students, I don't care about the students who want to go out and make a lot of money and they don't care about history of thought. Fine, don't be in my class. But the ones who are really intellectually curious, often sometimes the same people who are quite sophisticated technically, to have those sorts of students in the class are great, and they seem to get a lot out of the class. So
that's true. That's true for U.S. private universities. The German public universities don't quite have that luxury. But I was more curious about your day-to-day interaction, if they are at all, with people like Pat Bayer, Bianchi, Cosme Nilud, or sort of my peers, of standard economics. Is there any interaction there with your group and them, or is this like you just meet in faculty meetings?
Mostly just in faculty meetings, and frankly, I don't think that we're all that unusual. It's only that we're a much smaller group, but the macro group sticks with themselves, and the micro groups. I mean, it's a siloed kind of department, the way that many large research departments are. We're all cordial. But each group protects its turf, and we're the smallest group. So you can imagine how that often turns out in terms of being able to gain names on resources or lines for hiring. That is a challenge for us, but it's always been on a very cordial level. Of course, we're in the American South, Rudy, so things are much more cordial.
Okay, I think we should open up the floor for more questions from the audience. And I think the first on the list is Ibanka Anon, if I pronounced that correctly. I hope I did moderately, at least.
Yeah, no, you did perfectly. Can everyone hear me okay? My internet is a little unstable. Okay, wonderful. So I have a question for both of you. First of all, I'm so glad I caught wind of this event on Twitter. It's been fantastic. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on when in a student's career is really the best time for them to become exposed to history of economics. And I would love to give just like a few personal anecdotes. So for me, I was an economics major as an undergraduate, was feeling frustrated by, the seemingly non-humanistic nature of it. Now that I'm much older, I know that it's because I want to be a humanist. And so I was able to take a history of economic thought course as a sophomore. And that's when I realized I want to become a historian and a historian of economics. I also have a friend right now who is doing their PhD in econ at Stanford, and he's now participating in those seminars that they're hosting, which a few people in this seminar have been presenting at. And he, is going to be a social scientist. He wants to be an economist. And I think for him, that was the perfect time for him to become introduced to history of economics. And we're having really enriching and intriguing discussions with each other. So I really wanted to hear from both of you. Is there an ideal time that something like this can be offered to students in their journey?
Can I jump in? So thank you for the question, and thank you for mentioning Stanford. I'll say a couple of things about Stanford at that moment. I think it's a good way. So I think, again, I was speaking about those small courses as a first step. I do believe that either as a freshman or as a sophomore, I think in the beginning of your economics education, you don't quite know what you really picked, right? So in the German system, you just go to university at 18. There is nothing like college, and you have picked something with a curious abbreviation, three letters, and you don't really know what that is, right? And so I do believe that we have to motivate students that that was the right choice. And so an undergrad course in the beginning, which would more focus on persons, debates, as Rudy said, the great books type of way. Now, and I do believe that on the grad students level, as we do it at Stanford, which is purely voluntary, so we contacted all grad students, and we have a session every 2 weeks, and we have somewhere between 15 and 40 attendants, depending on probably the topic, right? I think that can also help to reflect while you're doing your heavily technical courses, to reflect what you actually want to do in your thesis, for which in the US you have those years, right? So it can be, but that should be a different course. I think that should be a course heavily on history of economic analysis or history of economic theory, if you want, right? So I would do the two courses with a different motivation, but also with a different content. Mm-hmm. At Stanford, we are struggling with finding that, because again, what do people know? What do they want? I mean, it's a process, but it's a fun to calibrate the course.
Deirdre has the second on the list.
You're muted.
There, okay.
There we are.
The year before I started graduate school at Harvard, having been an undergraduate at Harvard College, Harvard, in one of its contributions to the barbarization of economics, had abandoned the history of thought course. When I was at Chicago on faculty, George Stigler, who taught the required graduate history of thought course, led the charge against the history of thought, which I tried to stop, but I couldn't. So look, a long time ago, Axel Leonhofen made, I think, a very good argument for the history of thought, which is that any subject, chemistry, history, whatever, music for that matter, is like a branching tree. And at the branch points, there are choices made. And those choices determine what the higher branches are able to do. And of course, the choice of those branchings off in the tree are made, as has been said, in a historical context. This is the important point about sophisticated intellectual history of the Johns Hopkins and Cambridge sort, that you've got to know what's going on at those nodes, at those branching points. Now, what Axel said is this, and I'd be interested in how either of you or all of us feel about this. He said, if you find when you get out to the end of one branch in labor economics or economic history or anything you want to name, that you're in a degenerating research program, which I think, well, let's take, I don't want to insult people, but there are lots of them in any scientific field. As he said, to know what to do next, it's very good to know the previous nodes, the previous branching points, because then you can go back and say, for example, was Keynes right? Was it a sound decision on his part to abandon completely free markets, as though that's what they were, but anyway, completely free markets in favor of management from the top, mainly by John Maynard Keynes? And then you can go the other way. So how do you feel about Axel's argument?
Woody, would you like to start?
Yeah, I'm not convinced. I think this is one perspective on a development of a field. And it's an interesting one, but I don't think it's sort of, it's the only one or the necessary one. You know, economists are, for better or for worse, mostly worried or mostly driven by substantive questions, like, you know, literally like, you know, is a training program in Kentucky, you know, does that increase employment for Black women, stuff like that? Okay?
Yeah.
That's sort of or macroeconomists, you know, should the Fed, when should the Fed start raising interest rates, right? Or a current debate, to literally take a debate of today or these days, you know, is the Biden stimulus plan too much, will it lead to overheating, and, you know, what are the arguments pro and con? It's really these kind of things. And I don't know that studying Keynes or, you know, studying these branches has us a lot to tell us, has a lot to tell us about precisely these questions.
Well,
right?
I think you're quite wrong about that, but
we will have to disagree.
But no, wait. What you just said is that I agree with you. That practical policy questions are often not of a character that would be helped by this, but theory questions are. I think the whole theory of, say, a stimulus program, what amounts to a Keynesian stimulus program, which is the idea that journalists and other practical people and politicians have in their mind, is you can rethink in a way you can't if you're off on this one branch where you've been assuming for half a century that node went in the right direction. Here's a more concrete example.
Can I jump in? Chime in here? I disagree. Sure. I really don't think that, you know, debates about Keynes versus Hayek or ISLM and what the IS curve looks like, or the LM curve, or whatever the AD curve looks like, are not going to help us. We need to think. You really need to think. Here's where you need to get into the weeds, and where you have to be sort of really modern about things. For example, you really need to know, if you want to assess stimulus packages and their efficacy, You really need to be very serious about the wealth distribution, the underlying wealth distribution, the underlying distribution of debt, the underlying MPC distribution. That's what it really is. So just to give, to put a name on this, what people are trying to do with a business cycle, distribution of business cycle models in the last maybe 10 years. I really disagree that that sort of in terms of really quantitatively informing the debate, you want to go back all that far into history.
Rudy, I think, may I jump in? I think you're right within a paradigm.
Yeah, that's the point.
I think if we hope, then any one of us here will set up a new paradigm, which of course is not a very modest hope, but we nevertheless hope to. Then it makes sense to go back to see where did the old paradigm start off, what were alternative roads not taken, which I could exploit for being somebody who really sets up something new. And again, the question of what is
I agree with you, but most practical economists of today are not interested in setting up the new paradigm.
Well, I'm not sure. Oh, I'm not sure about that.
At least most of my colleagues. I'm not, and most of my colleagues aren't. And so we are interested in, what is the effect of the Biden stimulus program?
But if we say that DSGE, let's try to take an example, right? So if we say that DSGE was something like a new paradigm, right? I think you would be proud to be the person to have set it up, right? So if we frame paradigm in those practical terms, but that could, studying the 30s and the debates, not just Keynes, but also people like Robinson and others could have helped, right, to move away from real business cycles and towards DSGE. So I think that's what Deidre means by the branches and by studying how we went and what alternative not exploited branches we could take. And I think anybody of us would be happy to have been the first DSGE guy. But for that, and those are those low-hanging fruits.
I would call it a paradigm. I mean, sort of.
Well,
I mean, the neo-Keynesian synthesis, if you want to call it, which is the DSGE models, they were a response, obviously, to the question of why monetary policy has any real effect at all, yes. Right? But that is entirely data-driven in some sense. I mean, we have statistical methods that tell us that monetary policy has real effects, small ones. In that sense, the real business cycle wasn't all that bad, by the way. And the real business cycle, by the way, was an entirely necessary revolution, I would say. We needed to get rid of the 10,000 equation Keynesian models and their clutter, okay, that helped us not understand anything. And so the real business cycle model was exactly the right thing at the time. I agree with you, at the time, because it needed to show us the genius of the real business cycle model is to actually teach us that aggregate fluctuations can at least in part be equilibrium phenomena. That's the genius of it. And so I think that is a truly scientific revolution. Of course, that it's wrong to say that all aggregate fluctuations are efficient and equilibrium phenomena, but that they can in part be. That's the contribution, the intellectual contribution of the RBC models or the RBC school. And I think that's absolutely important. Of course, taking it to the extreme, then of course that was too much. And again, but most people, with the exception of Prescott and Kittler themselves, probably never took it quite to the extreme. So.
Well, I agree with you. But you didn't have to do it the data-driven way. I mean, if you study the way the things Arash is doing with the 1920s and 30s, and their debates about neutral money, multiple equilibria, that could have been informative, right? So I agree with you that it could come out of data, but it could also come out of studying old histories, old theories. And if you really penetrate the old theories as Arash does, it can get you precisely there. That's
true, but it also can potentially hinder you. Sure, as I said, it was necessary to get rid of the 100 and 500 equation models. I mean, that was I don't know what what dying paradigms or degenerate paradigms Professor McCloskey has in mind, but that was a degenerate. I mean, that was objectively a degenerate paradigm, and we needed to get rid of it. And well, we got rid of it I think in a way that was entirely fruitful. Not in a way that I believe that the real business cycle model is a good description of reality, far being from it, but it has aspects of it, and sort of opens up thought horizons that I don't think we had before. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the economic historians will tell me otherwise. The historians of thought.
Hendrik Ritter is the next one on the question list.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I want to concur Professor Bachmann, a very special point. Working at one of the few institutions in Germany that has about 300 to 400 economists, being the Federal Ministry of Finance, I can absolutely ensure that the most important point to understand at this moment for us is how do these programs like the Biden program or the German program, you know, Scholz Bazooka, how do they work? And while I loved my history of economic science and history of economic thought class with Professor Schrödiauer in Magdeburg, I definitely had too few macro courses. Yeah, of course, we had the chance during this crisis, and Professor Bachmann knows very well because he was one of the guys we got in contact to. We have the option to get into touch with experts and try to elaborate on current programs and on data and so forth. But of course, last year in March and April, we didn't have the time to get into contact with anybody that could be relevant. And of course, from the commentary side, and this is a rather German problem, I think. In Germany, we are still very strongly influenced by older paradigms, still having current researchers being aligned to several groups, and I don't think this helps at all. And for the students to be trained in a way that they will be able to grasp what is currently happening, and that they are able to make insightful economic advices. And I think most of the economic students will end up at some kind of economic advisor, be it in a political institution, be it in a private institution, and they have to be able to grasp how the current environment will evolve and how policy in this environment will affect actual outcomes. And I would say every part of the curriculum should be analyzed and how does it fit into this target? How does it fit into this aim? Then, of course, I think it's important to have an idea on where do our current paradigms come from. But I don't think that is something that has to be done in the first 3 years, actually, because until that point, most students still have to learn the language at all. How do economists think? Why do economists think this way, of course, but we don't have to teach all the history that is there. But again, of course, at some advanced point that can come in, that should come in. But at the lower levels, I think having a strong grasp of the most important techniques, what are incentives, what are opportunity costs, and how does modern macro work is the most important part of the curriculum.
Can I briefly reply?
Yeah, sure.
So Hendrik, I fully agree that I wouldn't put historians of economics in charge of a BMF, right? So that is, I mean, that's not our job description. But since we know each other and since you know the youngsters, which every summer in the previous years we try to bring, so it's connected to NOUS, an academy for high school students who are at the brink of entering university. You saw the kids and the, you know, that, let me call it somewhat abstract, but certainly hunger for to learn what economics is. And they did find the BMF experience always extremely interesting. At the same time, they were trying in the other courses which we were doing to understand the qualitative or conceptual tools, right? So because otherwise, I mean, we tried to teach them in your with your colleagues what is a tax projection and how do you do all that. But as Deirdre McCloskey would say, it's the concepts first, and only then do you have a qualitative understanding of what's going on, and only then can you do meaningful empirical work, right? And so my point is not that historians of economics are something like the eierlegende Wollmilchsau, which can be in charge of public finance. But for example, to make a small case, I think the German tradition of public finance, which died out just as history of economics did, I think could be the study of public finance in the German tradition as a part of history of economics in the German specificity of economics could be helpful to motivate people to understand why economists used to care so much about the state, about taxation and spending way before Keynes. So that could be helpful to motivate them to go precisely in the job direction which you picked. And that goes, as you know, until into the 17th century, right?
As far as I see, Eki Köhler from Freiburg is the next one.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope that you can hear me.
Yep.
I just wanted to address the audience that there is a very interesting side discussion going on in the chat box here on Zoom. And well, I do not feel competent enough to all sum it up. I just wanted to make a certain point, which is to go a little bit backwards in the whole talk here, and I wanted to stress that you know, where is evolution coming from in economic science? And evolution is coming from, of course, from the different method that economic science is using. You know, from empirical research, you know, that you know, informs theory. Theory is changed a bit, and then, you know, we find new empirical evidence, and we go on, which is perfect. But the point is that history of economic thought can broaden the set of principal alternatives for theoretical assumptions that are or that can be tested, you know, and how can, you know, how we might find further progress. And I just want to give two examples, which is my point of view, a very good case why we need a certain well, history of economics class, thought class for PhD candidates, for example, which is on the one side in monetary policy, for example. You know, most PhDs, most economists, you know, they basically start out in our days with Mike Woodford. But there's a long story that has been told before Mike Woodford was on this earth. And I think that, you know, very brilliant minds that you know, that who made their own contributions for the theoretical development of macro. For example, Ben McCallum, for example, you know, they were very much influenced by history of economic thought, you know, by being at UVA, hanging out there with Leland Jaeger in the beginning of the 1960s, you know, when he was compiling this brilliant book of In Search of a Monetary Constitution with Milton Friedman, James Buchanan, so many other people. So I just wanted to make the point that to understand modern macro and monetary policy, I think it's super relevant to understand how all of these things like central bank independence, the Taylor rule came about. And to understand this context is, I think, very, very important because, oh yeah, and the second point I just wanted to make is capital theory. Arash is somebody who is absolutely, you know, knowledgeable in this field, absolutely. But most of the macroeconomists basically start out, you know, with Hicks, and that's basically it, you know. So, but there's so much more that, you know, that can be told here about why we have a certain form of capitalism going on. So this makes it a little bit, maybe a little bit more catchy in the education of PhD students to tell these stories. And to make a long story short, to help students and to help economists to find alternative set of theoretical assumptions that might be tested and that might contribute to theoretical evolution. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Stefan or Rudi, do you want to answer to this?
Well, just briefly, because I mean, I'm neither into money nor into capital, but a fascinating way, and that probably also strengthens Ecki's point, is the way, and many of us have heard of the list, and some of us are on that mailing list, German economist Karl Christian von Weizsäcker, the way he's using inspirations, let's say from Böhm-Bawerk or from Fischer, or right. So somebody who is very knowledgeable about the history of the field can be extremely innovative, even at old age, about very current issues, whether we agree with him or not. But it's certainly a very original take, both when it comes to theory of interest and capital and money. So I think he can be taken, the ones of you who know him, as really an ideal how history of thought, serious study of history of thought, can inform highly innovative research. I don't know, Rudi, if you agree with that, but that is how I would basically fortify and strengthen what Ecki said.
I agree, and I actually want to just repeat what Ara said in the chat. Emmanuel Fari, rest in peace, actually did that recently, taking up capital theory, if I remember correctly. But my answer to that is yes, absolutely, just do it. What's preventing you from doing it in some sense, okay? Everyone who I mean, there's no one that prohibits anyone from going through old economic texts and find inspiration for today. I'm certainly not denying that can be a source, a strong source of inspiration, just as I said, empirical evidence or other, you know, or other things, you know, political urgencies, for example. All these things can be strong motivators, and I'm not denying that anyone should not do it. Who am I to tell anyone, basically, where they get their research inspiration from? But so in that sense, I fully agree, and that's basically jives with my my initial statement. You know, to the extent that, you know, sort of reading old books and you know, making that helps making a contribution to current debates, both on the theory front or on the policy front. I'm all for it, and who wouldn't be in some sense, right? Yeah, I'll just leave it at that. What I'm less, as I said, what I just can only repeat it, what I'm less interested in is sort of economic history, sort of for its own sake, whatever that means. And even that is a certain, you know, is obviously a justifiable intellectual exercise, just as, you know, being an ancient historian is. It's just of less interest to me as a current economist, that's all.
But Rudi, I agree that people are free to do whatever they want, but of course preferences are shaped. And people, I mean, I've been to 2 AEA conferences, and I love the AEA ASSA setting. I just don't know if people like top grad schools graduates, if they really know that those old text exists and that the very roundabout way to get into them is worth pursuing, right? So of course they're free to do that, but they don't even know that a course, history economic thought, exists because they've been educated without one. So shaping their preferences and shaping their alertness that there might be something out there in the old books to dig at, I think, is the prerequisite for them to look.
The problem is that I would argue, and now we can that sort of, we have an identification problem. What Emmanuel Fari did, or people like Ivan Werning, you know, the great theorists of our time, that's extremely rare, right? So the typical inspiration will come from a very mundane, you know, policy problem, as I said, evaluating the minimum wage in Kentucky. Okay, that's That's how economists write dissertations. Maybe that's what Professor McCloskey calls the degeneracy of economics. I don't know, but that's the fact on the ground. I mean, that's what economic dissertations are written about, and what people are, frankly, policymakers are interested in. And I'm not sure that those dissertations will be inspired by going back to the going back to the great books. Someone mentioned, I think in the chat, that it's theory that should be more inspired. But newsflash, theory period is in decline in economics. You know, we will have discussions, and we already have them. In fact, the way, for example, Raj Shetty, when Raj Shetty took over from Greg Mankiw, the Econ 101, right? He completely revamped that curriculum in a very empiricist kind of way, right? So Harvard educates their undergraduates in the first economic course they see, and frankly, an economic course that a lot of Harvard undergraduates see. I believe a third of Harvard undergrads hear that, even if they're not econ majors, in a way that, yeah, that follows the Raj Shetty program, which is an highly empiricist program. Okay, and that's it. So theory is on the decline. I think we will have debates in at least lower ranked graduate school graduate programs to dispense with a second year with an entire year of microeconomic theory. Frankly, these debates will be ongoing, and by the way, and maybe this is a point of alliance between history of economic thought people and people like macroeconomists like me, who still value a little bit of theory. But this is the fight we will be having. I mean, even demanding, you know, a minimum basic amount of theory is on the decline. I'm afraid, quite frankly. So the empirical turn in economics is overwhelming, and yeah, given that, I think the case for the history of economic thought is even more difficult to make. And of course, there will always be the Faris and the Ivan Wernings, or the Carl Christian von Weizsäckers, who will get this inspiration. And we need to find a way to keep that alive, but it's going to be a struggle.
But don't you think that, I mean, I find it super interesting what you say. Don't you think that, again, thinking of potential complementarities, that if you study, I mean, for example, if I put myself into the shoes of somebody 25 at Harvard, or 20 or whatever, right? So, and then he's confronted with that choice which you made, right? So theoretical research or empirical turn. Wouldn't it be helpful for that person to have heard of the Methodenstreit, to have heard how the historical school ended into nothing, to a certain extent precisely because it exaggerated the empirical turn? I think that today's student who is confronted with the debate which you just addressed doesn't even have the categories to understand those tensions, and it would be a low-hanging fruit to teach him where that led in the past, right?
I think
I agree with you. They should learn about the Methodenstreit. I'm afraid the powers to be and the power structure in the profession is at a phase where I think the Schmollers, was it Schmoller? Yeah, that the Schmollers are taking over again. I think that's just a fact, an undeniable fact. And frankly, I'm not high enough up the food chain to do anything about it.
I think I
regret it.
I think this very nicely leads to a question that Michael Wohlgemuth posted in the chat a while ago. Do you want to pose it yourself, or should I read it, Michael? Okay, I read it. So Michael asked, you mentioned the beauty of economics. Most students find it rather ugly, dismal, but at least perhaps useful. Where's the beauty, the emotional attraction in economics? How could it be generated? And does the history of economic thought play a role there?
Most of Michael's question, it's a wonderful one. I would even say a beautiful one.
Yep.
So I think to begin with, it's helpful to readdress that old question, which is hardly addressed in any econ textbook today, which is economics a science or an art? Now, if we say that there is something like art to it, which would mean that ethics and aesthetics have a place in economics, right? That we are a science, but as all social sciences, we are somehow a mixture of the two. Then we can start reflecting about issues like beauty. And beauty, I don't mean in the formal sense. I never was bad at math and I didn't find mathematical models ugly. The beauty I find in moments of teaching, whomever I might be teaching, and don't have to be my students in Zwickau, it can be other students. The beauty is whenever you have an audience of students ahead of you who realize how that science helped get poor people out of poverty. And so if you take history of economics and show those super diverse characters, which are on that AEA calendar behind me, and if you show that actually most of them, and perhaps on an abstract level, all of them had that one goal, and that the field itself, being a science, but also again, being an art, and governance is probably more an art than a science, succeeded in getting so many billions of people out of poverty, that is a moment of beauty. So that's how I would define it.
Thank you, Stefan. That was a very beautiful answer to this tricky question, because I think, you know, emotional attraction for the field of economics and the emotional beauty to be able to help other people, you know, get out of poverty, and as you mentioned, is a very important point. Thanks.
Rudi, do you also have an opinion on this?
I mean, sort of Stefan outlined one approach. I think at the end of the day, in my experience, is you got to be motivated yourself as a teacher. You basically have to be brimming for fascination with economics. That's basically half, if not 3/4 of what gets you good evaluations, but not just good evaluations, genuine appreciation from the students. So you just don't, in that sense, you really shouldn't be a dull person in the classroom. I was thinking I was thinking about another problem that sort of spontaneously occurred to me when Stefan talked about the, yeah, mostly, I guess, and probably exclusively white men behind him. I'm worried about, not at Notre Dame, we don't have too much of a work rate at Notre Dame, but I'm worried about, you know, at least at US college campuses of a more secular direction. I'm worried, frankly, that if you start telling them that, you know, our science is basically completely white men, they're going to go ballistic. I mean, I'm not even sure that would all help all that much. Quite frankly, I think it might go the opposite way. They might actually find out that it's, you know, it's all those old white men that, you know, instituted capitalism and suppressed, you know, people of color. So I'd be careful with that, by the way, at least in a US context. I'm a cynical, I know, but.
Well, no, I share this apprehension, and I think we should be sensitive to those things. I fully agree. Fortunately, it can be also taught differently, and yeah. But again, perhaps it's also a way to understand how long women were kept from studying that beautiful field, right? But again, I fully agree that this is not, and it is already a problem for political scientists and philosophers teaching. So when I was in Bloomington, that was a recurrent issue. Yeah.
There's another question from Gerd Wegner in the chat, and I think it would be interesting to have the perspectives of both of you on it. And it's simply, is there a standard for good history of economic thought?
Gerhard, that's a tough one. Because I think good depends on, as always, on the purpose you're reaching for. I think regarding students, we talked a lot, right? So I think good history of economics would be history of economics which gets students hooked for economics. So that would be the standard for good with regard to students. And also critical about what they're taught in their theory and methods classes, right? So that would be the standard. And when it comes to research, I would say good means inspiring. So if the Stanford series inspires grad students there to think about issues which they haven't thought of because they had never heard of a person and of a branch in the tree which Deidre described, that would be good. So inspiring, illuminating, provocative, that would be, when it comes to research, the translation of good, which I would give.
I'd agree with that. Nothing to add.
Okay.
May I qualify the question? What does scientific progress mean in the field of the history of economic thought? Is there a standard for this?
That's an even tougher one. Because, well, we compare apples and bananas, right? So we compare, let's say, if we take Schumpeter or Pribram, or if we take, well, I mean, they were socialized in a very different way. They produced their papers and books for a very different audience. So humble and skeptical as I am about progress in economics, in the way I try to do it in a non-nihilistic way, I'm probably even more skeptical about progress in history economic thought. I mean, the field exists. The field is a baby of the historical school, right? So it doesn't exist that long. It exists in a systematic way for about, let's say, 150 years now. But then the modes of production and those different dots, I think, constitute a time series or a panel which is so heterogeneous about the people who produced, about the purposes of what they did, that I don't know about progress. And certainly, I think none of the historians here, including the most ambitious ones, would say that they have passed over Schumpeter or reached over, right? So I don't know. I think it's a super difficult to answer.
Okay, thanks. Casey Pender is the next one.
Hi. Yeah, thanks, guys. This has been super interesting so far. I have a question, sort of maybe more directed to Professor Kolob, but coming off of something Professor Bachmann had sort of started off with in his intro. And this is sort of coming from the perspective of a PhD student in a North American university. But I think in some of the ways you guys have pushed forward the value of history of economic thought is I'm very sympathetic towards, right? Like the sort of ideal case of, going into these old books and grappling with some of these old ideas and then being able to use that to inform, either critique or push forward, current models in economics. But it seems to me in order to do that, you first need to understand the current models. And, that's becoming increasingly difficult to do, right? As sort of Rudy mentioned, these models are becoming more and more technical. We only have a very short amount of time in graduate school to learn all these things. And so my worry is sort of twofold. One, you can have, Stefan, what you mentioned earlier is this sort of bad history of thought where you get people critiquing current economic models without really having ever taken the time to understand what's actually going in the models. And without throwing anyone under the bus for saying that, you often see maybe like Austrians critiquing DSGE models, likely never having worked with the DSGE model or knowing the sort of the guts of the model at all. But then vice versa, if we're to unless we're maybe at Harvard, this isn't a problem where everyone's a genius, but at normal, if we're not in the top tier schools, I'm not sure we have the time in the day to both learn, these heterogeneous new Keynesian models, but also scour through Wieser in a way that we can actually digest these things and internalize these debates. And so I'd be curious to know, Stefan, with the sort of the increase in the technical requirements of a grad school, how you'd balance the time it would take to sort of take these historical debates seriously.
Let me first briefly agree with what Erwin wrote in the chat about, let's say, a case in point being Smithian or Adam Smith scholarship and how it progressed. So that's an answer to Gerhard's question. Casey, good to see you again. So thank you for the question. Again, it's not an either or. I don't say that you should study history instead of models or instead of empirical methods. And of course, the emphasis remains on theory and empirical methods. I just believe that and we've had many conversations over beer about that in Prague, so it's not the first one, this case of disclosure here. I think the curious question is really, what type of students do we attract to economics? And at the beginning, as I see it, you have a very diverse crowd in the audience. And the question is, who is left after the first year? And I'm afraid, and again, that varies over countries, and of course, a PPE program like the one you studied is different. But I'm afraid that the ones remain who are interested in the technicalities, nothing against that. And I'm afraid of losing those who are perhaps not that good at math and the models, but could cope with the math and the models, but who actually picked the field because they heard that economics has something to do with inequality, something to do with unemployment and all that, and have also ethical concerns which are on their minds, so they want to improve the world. And I'm afraid of losing those kids, right? So, and for that, I would again plea, so my plea is really some small history, some small methodology course, can be one, can be two, doesn't matter, not to lose those kids with social questions and with ethical concerns. I don't mind keeping the other ones, but I don't want a monoculture of the other ones who then dominate the sophomore and other years, because that would be a heavy loss, right?
Okay, then we have Ottmar Issing on the list.
Thank you. First, I must apologize because I had to leave for some time. So if I repeat something which was said, I apologize. But I was induced to make a comment when it was about beauty. Beauty is an emotional category, a category of preferences, etc. And I was reminded in this moment there's a beauty contest. When I was at the ECB and there were new publications, I had no time to read or fully understand. I asked an expert in my staff. And on such a situation, an expert came. It was a model by Woodford. And he was so fascinated. And I said to him, you are fascinated by that. And he said, it's because of the beauty of the model. So there are different kinds of model. I would agree with Stefan that most students might have more sympathy for the not mathematical beauty. But there is also a category for which also the aesthetics of a model represent a kind of beauty. So I was just differentiate this remark a bit. And second, I think it's obvious if economists make recommendations for the real economy to improve the situation of people, poor, etc., without knowledge of the political circumstances of history and history of economic thought, they must fail. They must fail. And to what extent this prerequisite, which is indispensable, is lost. Just take the example of the so-called new monetary theory. It means that the government can print money at will, and as soon as this will end in inflation, then the government will raise taxes and collect the money which creates inflation. Against the background of any historical experience, this is nonsense, or such a naivety of the political process that I think it should be totally ignored. Anybody who would make such a proposal for politics in reality should be laughed at. And I think it was Larry Summers who said this who do economics or whatsoever. But this knowledge is lost. And so those proposals come on a high level, and it had has a substantial influence on political thinking in the Democratic Party, for example, in the US. And my final point is the following. We can observe that after 3 decades now of very low inflation, there is spreading the notion that inflation is something of the past. Something of the past. And I think history and history of economic thought tells us be at least cautious. Things are changing. And the idea that as Bob Schiller has, this time is different. It was by my God, the 2 authors, Ken Rogoff. This time is different. And this is the core of the problem, because the notion before the last financial crash was that we live in a different time. This time is different. And they have shown that over a period of 800 years with more than 60 countries, whenever there was a high indebted situation of economy, of the public and private sector, financial collapse followed. So today you can observe in many technical papers, they rely on the notion that this time is different, hedging is so perfect, etc. So I think seeing a new approach in the context of the past, I think helps to be. I'm not against writing intellectually high motivating papers, but they should not claim that this is something which should be tested in reality or could be tested. I think this the warning for me, history of economic thought and knowledge of history implies above all a warning against modes, fashions in economics. I should stop here.
Thank you.
If I can chime in quickly,
yeah,
because the historian of the theoretician of economic thought makes me correct Professor Issing a little bit. I think he meant the modern monetary theory, the MMT.
Yeah.
New monetary economics is actually something different. That's a very different research program, which is centered around search theory, and which is very different from modern monetary economics.
Absolutely. Sorry.
Yeah.
It was
we will have to be precise. Yeah. Okay. I wanted to say the other thing I wanted to say is. And I think economic historians and historians of economic thought need to think a little bit about maybe the marketing here, because the way Professor Issing now justified looking into history is largely saying we need to have a sense of economic history, not necessarily of the history of economic thought, right? And that I think sort of mainstream economists, especially after the financial crisis, would be much more sympathetic for, right? I think economic history has had a genuine revival in the field because it sort of drew in young people with modern techniques. As I said, Moritz Schullerich in Germany is one of them. Christoph Trebesch is another one. Those two are publishing at the highest levels. They are, recognized in the international research community. So that economic history, especially economic macro history, is an important dimension that we should probably teach more in economic curricula. I think that by now is complete consensus. I guess we could do more, so this needs to be implemented, but at least the idea, there's a big consensus there. And maybe, by the way, strategically and marketing-wise, there's something to be learned also for historians of economic thought, be learned you guys could learn something from the economic historians, because as I said, they actually had a successful renaissance, I would claim. And so, but on the other hand, if it can't be the claim for the existence of the history of economic thought cannot just be the things that Professor Ising just mentioned, namely that we should be aware of, historical episodes where certain fashionable things went horribly wrong, because that already is taken care of by the economic historians themselves, and they have a place already. So the history of economic thought has to deliver something else, I would say. And what that something else is, that's for you to think about, I guess.
I apologize. It's of course modern MMT. Very clear.
Let me try to make two brief suggestions as to what historians of economics could contribute. So I fully agree with Ottmar Ising about that we lost the political in political economy. And so coming back to the branches of Diderot and Klossky, I think that twist from political economy to economics is one of those which personally, given my research interests, which are somewhere between history of economic and history of political thought, is the most curious branch. So what got lost there, and to what extent can we reclaim that by the way political economy is practiced by today's economists? So is that really the comeback of the political, or do we need to take it even more seriously? And so for that, I'm specifically happy that the center at Duke is not called Center for the History of Economics, but a Center for the History of Political Economy, because I think that name actually admonishes and warns us that we should always see the economic in the context of the political and in the other orders. And the second thing about what economics can contribute to such discussions about the history of economics, this time it's all different. I think, and again, I have to say something good about the historical school, being the editor of Schmoller's Jahrbuch. And the historical school actually was having a very, I think, interesting debate within itself as to the topicality of theories. So when do we have a theory which is important, which for that time and space, in that institutional and cultural context helps, and when not? Whereas in today's economics, we believe that a theory is either right or wrong, either logically consistent or not, which is certainly true, but that is not enough, right? So we have to say within the logically consistent theories, which are the ones which help in that specific point of time with that specific crisis which we are fighting. And I think history of economics, precisely by showing why we forget theories which are not topical, but then those theories come back, just like, broadly speaking, Keynesianism after the financial crisis. Well, in a stable world, we don't need it. In a less stable world, we do. So forgetting can be an omission, right? So I think in that regard, studying history of economics makes you aware that a forgotten theory is not a bad theory and can be extremely helpful if the constellation of time and space reappears, again, the context.
But I disagree with you slightly. I mean, that is a bit, now you are committing the mistake that you said you don't want to commit, namely, I think you are selling, in this particular case, perhaps macroeconomists, modern macroeconomists, a little bit short, quite frankly. I mean, we are very aware of the scope conditions, right? And I mean, I'm sure the audience here knows that little beautiful book by Danny Roderick, Economics Rules, which is about it's all about that. It's all about scope conditions. And I mean, good economists know the scope conditions of their models. And they're very aware that a good model is not, a true theory or something that's sort of, always true and always applicable. I think good economists, even modern economists, know that. They're always bad economists, by the way, and bad economists are precisely who are not aware of the scope conditions. And that's precisely the reason why I don't know why you can claim that Keynesianism has come back. I mean, we've always taught, at least in our undergraduate classes, I've never stopped teaching Keynesian economics. And I also have taught, you know, classical business or neoclassical business cycle models, precisely because I want undergrads to understand that there is no such thing as one model of the business cycle, but it's, you know, there are multiple models of the business cycle that help us understand various aspects of the business cycle. I would be shocked if I'm the only one who teaches macroeconomics like that. We have always taught multiple models for one and the same phenomenon. And that, I don't think we ever abandoned that. So now you sold us a little short, Stefan, I think.
Okay. Perhaps it depends on one's teachers. And,
okay, perhaps, but I would be shocked if I'm unique.
Yeah.
I'm using standard textbooks. So.
Okay, so we've been discussing for 2 hours, and I think it's about time to come to an end before we all get too exhausted. I'm sorry to all whose comments in the chat and other comments we can't discuss anymore. So just as 2 brief closing statements from both of you, I'd like to just know very briefly if you can give one seminar on a specific topic in the history of economic thought, just one seminar. What would you choose as a topic? Rudi, if you want to start.
That's extremely difficult because I'm really a lay person as far as so I would feel overwhelmed, quite frankly. Yeah, I'm going to say sort of the rise of RBC theory basically, and that I think this is an important breaking point and a bit underappreciated. I really do believe actually that RBC theory is unjustly bashed these days. Again, if you're an ideologue like I guess it's fair to say Ed Prescott is, then that is a problem. But it really opened up thought horizons to me at least. That were unknown to me, so I'd think harder about that kind of episode. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. And Stefan?
Oh, it doesn't come as a surprise, but I would like to motivate it very briefly. What I would teach, and not just now to piss Rudi off or something like that. That's not what I was doing in the 2 hours, and I won't do it now again. But what I will teach, and I've taught or I've given that lecture at various places also in the US, is really that contested, and that's how I met Rudi for the first time in FAZ in 2009. I really teach with a passion a public lecture about ordoliberalism. And I'll tell you why. I teach it because we live, and that was different in 2009, right? So back then, indeed, you had a point that, well, what have those old guys to tell us? But the world in those 12 years, ever since the youngest Methodenstreit kicked off by your intervention, has become so fragile that regrettably, the world has become much more comparable to the world of the 30s and 40s. And that's why I believe that economics of the type of ordoliberalism, I mean, it doesn't have to be about the ordoliberals, but I think their legacy, they're conceptualizing the economy as a suborder within society, and their impetus to stabilize the whole, which in a certain abstract way is also not that different from Keynes's, is something which has regained its topicality, and I would say unfortunately so. Not only in the US, but certainly also in Europe. So that would be, and that has been over the past years, a lecture which I've given in different varieties. And again, in 2009, I was a grad student in my second year. The stuff was dead. Eki, I don't know if he's still here. Eki and I were the 2 guys who were doing stuff like that. Meaning history of ordoliberalism. Unfortunately, there is now a huge literature on that. And I say unfortunately because the times have changed so that this research program has gained its topicality. I love that as a scholar, but I hate that as a citizen.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks, Rudi. Thanks, Stefan, for this very lively discussion, for this very broad and deep discussion. It was very interesting, and thanks to all participants for comments. If we have a bit more time, it's really worth to read into the parallel discussion in the chat, which is also quite interesting. So thank you all, and I hope to see you soon at another NOUS event, and have a nice evening. Goodbye.